Here to introduce our next session is Head of South by Sports and South by Southwest Convergence Programming, Rebecca Pfefferman.
Hello. Is everyone having a good South by Southwest so far? Day one, it's a little rainy, staying dry. I think the sun cleared up. Just a little housekeeping. Obviously, download the app, start favoriting all your sessions, connect with your registrants on South by Social. We got a big week ahead of you, but I'm so excited that we get to kick it off here with this session. I run South by Sports, as the voice of God has told you, and I also run our Convergence programming here at South by Southwest. It's the third year of our track, but the NBA has been here for a long time, long before we started South by Sports, and we are so excited because they're such an innovative, progressive league. They've been on top of technology and innovation from the get-go, and in the last year and a half since Adam Silver took over the league, it's very clear his impact both on the court and in the game and in the league and the fandom. So I'm not here to talk about it. We're going to have Mr. Silver talk about that, but I'm going to bring out our moderator, Brian Stelter from CNN, so let's give him a big round of applause. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right. I'll start by bringing out the man who needs no introduction, Adam Silver, the NBA commissioner. All right.
Everybody?
So we'll do the briefest of bios for you because I think everybody in the room knows exactly who you are. You've been with the NBA in various capacities since 1992, deputy commissioner for almost a decade before taking over in 2014. So thinking back to 1992, the idea that you probably wouldn't have been coming to South by Southwest, what's changed about the NBA that brings you here today?
Boy, it's a great question. I mean, what has changed in many ways is the form in which our games are distributed. I mean, before you get to the whole now ecosystem of social media, I mean, for example, I was watching games on my phone last night. I mean, that in itself, I mean, I find it fascinating. There's so much discussion, just to jump ahead, about cord cutting now, for example, and yet, for me, on one hand, yes, you know, the number of basic cable subscribers is going down, but then I think of the literally millions of people who are now consuming live sports content on their phones or tablets in the same way I do. And in fact, I think ESPN in particular, you know, our games are on ESPN, ABC, and TNT, and that Watch ESPN app, I have to use as much as to watch ESPN as I do sitting in front of my large screen television at home.
You use the app as much as you do the big screen.
Yeah, I'm
so
sure I do.
So it's sort of a personal tipping point to watch on the mobile phone more than the big screen TV.
I'm sure I do, and in fact, and I've said this before, but even when I'm home, my wife makes fun of me because I then sit there with my tablet and the remote is like over there and the tablet is right here.
Right.
And I think still the user interface, at least on my cable system, reminds me of DOS for those people in the room who are old enough. You know, and then on the app, which I use, the NBA app, you know, on my tablet, you go doon, 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 and you don't have to search through, because now my cable system, I mean, that's one thing that's changed a lot since '92. I now have 2,000 channels on my, I literally have 2,000 channels on my cable system, and they changed the channel numbers, so finding League Pass, finding NBA TV, ESPN, TNT, you know, all of those, it's so much simpler just to go to the tablet. So I often find myself that, and the other thing, and this is just in the last few years, the clarity of that video. I would have never predicted that even 5 years ago, how easy it is to do. You know, there's no such thing as buffering anymore. We all talked about that. It's just there. It always works. It's clear. You can see it. So
even at a conference famous for its wireless problems and for people overloading the cell phone towers, we've come a really long way in a really short time. Does a part of you, though, sometimes wish that fans would watch the old-fashioned way, watch on the big screen the way God intended, because you can see every detail in crystal clear HD, or do we not really get to vote, so to speak? You know, we have to do what the consumers want.
Well, ultimately we have to do what the consumers want, but don't get me wrong, it's still there on those, you know, those beautiful, large, you know, Samsung, official partner of the NBA screens. There it is, you know, and it is a great experience. I'm only saying that. I recognize, I mean, especially, I mean, there are enormous number of advantages to having live perishable programming. And I think I've been reading your coverage of the debates, for example, and people literally can't tune them out, regardless of what their politics are. It's seemingly, it's great entertainment.
I mean, 12 million viewers last night. It's
right,
basically a sporting event.
Yeah, no, in many ways it is, and it's live, and you don't know what it's about to happen and who's going to say what, and I find myself glued to the set as well. You know, on the other hand, you know, in sports that to the extent it is perishable, you lose that other, for the games themselves, most people, unless they're truly hardcore fans, aren't going to 2 days later sit down and watch a 2.5-hour game. They're going to consume highlights, and they're going to consume other content around the NBA game. A lot of that may be, in certain cases, it is highlights. And I mean, if you think about, for those who saw the slam dunk contest this year on All-Star Saturday night, in fact, the volume of traffic of unique users downloading those videos actually, or streaming those videos, continues to increase, because it's almost by word of mouth, and it sort of, you know, becomes, you know, a global community of people saying, did you, you know, or tweeting, did you see that slam dunk? Did you see what Aaron Gordon did, et cetera? So, you know, but you know, so we're trying to constantly balance that, because there's advantages to having content that's more evergreen, that, you know, that people, you know, some of the great shows now that are produced and distributed over the top, you know, people who, you know, who haven't seen House of Cards. I mean, as the 3rd episode is coming out, I hear sort of chatter of people saying, you know, I never really got into House of Cards. I think I'm going to go back and start that show now, go back to the 1st season and start it. And for them, it's evergreen, right? And that's, so that may be the downside to perishable live programming, that on one hand, it's going to command that live attention just like the debates, but it's not necessarily going to have a real afterlife.
I haven't heard the word perishable used very often to describe live sporting events, but it's the perfect word, because you do have to consume it right away. And something like the slam dunk contest, it feels like it was made for Vine. It was made for that kind of short viewing experience. Tell me, going back to the 90s briefly, you know, as you were working your way up through the ranks of the NBA, did the league back then view itself as a media company? Or do you think only in recent years have you all come to realize this is a media company? You know,
I think we did, and so much credit goes to David Stern, because
there were some pioneering moves like the NBA cable channel.
Well, I'd say exactly, and even before the NBA's cable channel, NBA TV, which, by the way, you know, I was running something called NBA Entertainment at the time, and to show that we were at the epicenter of Convergence, it was launched as NBA.com TV. That's how smart we were. We're like, it's all
That's
one.
That's a typical thing to do. Because,
Put a .com on it, and everybody will. So we were there. But even before that, when I got to the NBA in 1992, David Stern had already created a division called NBA Entertainment. And NBA Entertainment was a production and distribution company. And I think it was David who realized that at root, we were a content company. I mean, of course, we're a sports league, but this was content that increasingly was becoming popular on a global basis. And 1992, when I started, I began at the NBA shortly before the now very famous Dream Team in Barcelona. And I think that was, you know, in essence, a tipping point for the international growth of the NBA. Michael Jordan, you know, Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, all the great stars being seen on a global basis. So what we then did, NBA Entertainment then became something much larger, but it began as a company that produced home videos. That was still back to the 90s. That was a huge business when I got there. And in fact, there are a whole generation of players, and I think of, for example, you know, Dirk Nowitzki, talking to him when he was earlier, or, you know, in his younger years in the league, when he talked about his early interest in the NBA, and it was of that generation of international star, it was often watching Come Fly With Me, which was a famous Michael Jordan home video, and others in that series. And it was, you would hear, like, I watched, you know, those old enough, I watched those home videos literally till the tape wore out, you know, and that's how they consumed NBA. And back in those days, you know, they used to use an expression in television distribution. They'd say you'd bicycle the tapes. And in essence, we used to, it was too expensive back then to satellite our games around the world, and there wasn't that same sort of availability of booking satellite time. So in my early days at the NBA, for our international distribution, we, in essence, FedEx the tapes around the world. And because there was no internet, you know, somebody could find the score somewhere, but in essence, our games would air this goes against the notion of perishable a little bit, but 2 days later, they would be showing games in prime time, and people would be watching them as original programming. Now that's impossible. And in fact, you know,
That's wild.
you know, a plug for you with reliable sources, you know, on CNN. I find when your discussion about the news media, I become even confused. Like when there's multiple debates, multiple news events for candidates, when things are being reported, I'm often confused as the news cycle because I still rely on a printed newspaper in the morning, but I've already looked at the internet and I'm thinking, is that the same event they're talking about, or has something been said since they said that? So, you know, I mean, so then NBA Entertainment, we then started producing, as the demand grew, our international broadcasters wanted highlight shows. So we started creating, in essence, shows that could then be customized in various regions. So in Russia, they had segments, and then they would hire Russian hosts and then create shows around those. But they were still not airing live. It would be airing a day later or 2 days later, you know. And then right around the beginning of sort of the internet boom, we built our website. And what's so fascinating, I think back then on the early days of NBA.com, the process we went through, for example, to produce a website that had a live scoring module.
Oh my gosh.
And a news module. And I remember, and
The most basic.
the most basic stuff. And I remember watching all the leagues go through this. And we were all doing it independently. It was before baseball had BAM, you know, now incredibly successful. But I remember early days of baseball, they didn't own MLB.com. In fact, their law firm owned it, Morgan, Lewis, Bacchius, whatever it's called, .com. And so they didn't have MLB.com. They were out there hiring, you know, Viant and Scient and all these companies that were out there in the early days. And we had, you know, several different companies coming in. And I remember it was really an enterprise of 50 people trying to get this right. And then the placement of it right, where should it be on the page and all that. And then what was fascinating to me, and you watched as we all saw traffic patterns, you know, not all of a sudden, but maybe 3-4 years later, you started looking at all the sports league websites, and they started to look exactly the same because everybody figured out, put the scores here, put, you know, the news feed here. People are interested in, you know, lifestyle programming over here. And I think then we went in a different direction than Major League Baseball did, where they got bigger and created this big in-house production company.
I was about to ask you, do you wish you had MLB Advanced Media? Did you wish that you all were streaming events for other companies? MLB streams HBO, for example.
You know, I don't. I mean, I respect their model, and Bob Bowman's done an incredible job, and we'll see where it goes from here. But I think we're so fixated on basketball, you know, that we never wanted to be in the business of promoting other leagues and other sports or servicing other sports. I mean, we had some brief conversations about it in the old days at NBA Entertainment, but in essence, we decided to go in another direction. And in essence, we now are in business with your company, with Turner, and we made a decision in New York that being in the one website business, the one network business, because by then it had become NBA TV, so we had our website, the team websites, all derivative of NBA.com, and we had NBA TV, and we made a decision that we just couldn't compete. And I remember even that whole notion of the scoreboards. I remember back in the day with Yahoo, they came out with, they were calling them widgets back then.
Right.
And I was, wow, you go click, click. And that's what we've been trying to create for 5 years. It's now, there it is, this live scoreboard that you can just stick on your screen. And sort of, and as new developments came, and I understand how baseball ended up in the business they're in, where they're servicing other sports, because I'm sure at some point they made the same decision that it was too inefficient to create this huge infrastructure to only service baseball. So they went the other direction and became a multimedia company, and now seemingly very successful, and are working on multiple sports. Instead, we partnered with Turner, and so now NBA TV is produced down in Atlanta, and to us and our websites that we get the benefit of the best technology that CNN is using and TBS, and so at least that was the direction we went in.
Yeah, let's zoom into the present day, because you've got, 9-year deals with Turner and with ESPN.
That don't even begin until next year, by the way.
That don't even begin until next year. So these long-term contracts, maybe the networks wanted them to be even longer. So what do you have to worry about? You've got your biggest TV deals all done.
Well, you know, David Stern used to say it's because we're Jewish. You know, the sky's always falling. It's like, you know, it's like, so there's that. But it's no, but in a way, I'd say, you know, having now been with the NBA for this will be my 24th year with the NBA. I would say it's amazing that weeks become months, months become years, years become decades.
You're saying 9 years isn't that
I'd
long?
say 9 years isn't that long, and it's sort of...
You're still figuring out where you're going to be.
We're still figuring out
period,
because even when we ended up doing, we did these deals that haven't even begun yet, we extended in essence early with our existing partners over a year ago. And there was even a thought from some people in the marketplace then that, why are you going early? You guys should be waiting even longer because, you know, who knows? And we're seeing it now in early days that Facebook clearly is looking now in live sports, you know, and some of the companies who have talked to us who haven't even announced publicly that they're looking necessarily into being in the live sports business. I mean, clearly Apple is looking at, you know, at exclusive programming to differentiate their services. And so I think the issue for us was we need, who knows, who can predict the future in terms of what the linear conventional networks will look like. I believe as I look at the marketplace that sort of what I guess, I don't know if it's still call them new media companies, but
right, are they new media
They're
anymore?
not those companies that
right.
Ultimately they're going to want to differentiate their services through live premium sports for the same reason that TNT, ESPN, Fox, et cetera, see so much value in us. But
these companies that haven't publicly announced yet, do they rhyme with Map Hat?
Well,
do they rhyme with Ritter? Can you talk to us?
Yeah, well, I would only say some of them. I mean that by there, some of them don't.
It didn't work.
Are more focused on audio rather than video right now, for example. Some of those companies, some of those very successful companies that are streaming over the top, but you don't associate with sports right now, are beginning to look at sports. That's all.
So your phone's ringing.
Yeah, but I think they
but
also...
can you take the calls, or do your TV deals prohibit you from doing a... so let's take up NFL. You mentioned Facebook. So the NFL has Thursday Night Football. They've sold the deal to CBS and NBC. Now they're selling the digital rights, maybe to Facebook, maybe to somebody else. Can you carve out the digital rights like that?
Well, let me begin by saying, like, nothing prohibits us from talking. And I would, back to your question about 9 years, I would say that part of my job is to be preparing for the next negotiation. And so there are the live games themselves, but then to us, there's all the other programming that exists around those live games, old-fashioned term shoulder programming or whatever else, those same highlight shows that I was creating at the NBA 20 years ago. And so part of it, it's whether what we do with Snapchat or Instagram or Facebook or whatever else, or what we do with Twitter, it's building that community. And often we're finding that, you know, the best way to replicate that arena experience, which people still love and people are still going to in record numbers, people are still filling NBA arenas, is the equivalent of doing it through social media. And like, for example, I find that when I watch NBA games, even by myself, like you are right now,
looking at Twitter questions from the crowd,
like, you know, that I find as I'm watching a game,
right.
I'm looking for the same way that you get a reaction in an arena. That so, what's the crowd think of that call, for example? What does the crowd think of the oohs and ahs from that move? You can get the equivalent on Twitter for the NBA. That there are, you know, a universe of people that I follow, many of them journalists, many of them executives in the league, people at other teams, and sort of I'm seeing, so how are they reacting in real time to what's happening?
But Twitter won't pay you for that, right? Can that become a financial relationship?
It is a financial relationship to a certain extent, but nothing like the big deals we have, you know, sort of distribute our live games.
Yeah.
But for me, like, it's largely a marketing tool right now for us, in that, you know, and I view our highlight business the same way. You know, people, I think even Mark Cuban, I think years ago, used the analogy of, you know, snacks and meals. That you're sort of, you want people to snack all, you know, with the belief that they'll pay for the meals. And by the way,
is that still true? Or you find that true?
Yeah, I think it's very true. And the best way to test that, I mean, our television deals locked in, largely built on basic cable penetration. On the other hand, you know, with all the discussion around over the top, we've had, in essence, our own over-the-top product for a long time. That's NBA League Pass, which you can, through that same app I was talking about earlier, what we're doing for the first time this year is allowing people to buy a single game. So for $6.99, you can buy a single game. And for fans out there who, for example, want to see every one of Kobe's last games, you know, I don't know, the Lakers have, let's say, roughly 16 games left in the regular season, and they're not going to the playoffs. Only I think it's roughly 5 of those games are going to be on national television through one of our services. If you want to watch those other 11 games and you live outside the Los Angeles market, and this really is now, and by outside the Los Angeles market, I mean anywhere in the world, you in essence can pay $7 and watch that game, you know, on your phone or your tablet. Same thing for the Golden State Warriors, that, you know, they have 18, 19 games left in the season. Only, I think, less than half of those games are carried on one of our national networks. Same thing, if you live outside the Bay Area and you want to watch that game. And what we're seeing is the direct correlation now that as those games are being tweeted about and talked about in various social media services, that it's a form of promotion by us, able to say, and if you want to see that game, you know, click here. You know,
buy it right away.
Buy it right away, and you can see it, and we find that's very effective.
How big is the market, you think, potentially for that? Because to me, League Pass seems like a very much a niche option right now.
I don't, you know, well, we've had 35 million downloads of the NBA app just in the United States so far this season, and I think for us, I mean, just think about the popularity of the Golden State Warriors. I mean, I think we're just scratching the surface, because one of the things that frustrates me right now in terms of our programming is that I think there's that the demand and supply curves aren't meeting. In essence, that we have these games through technology, and this is in essence a very new thing. Even the individual games are available across the board for the first time this season, because you can buy a single game. And I know the demand is out there for them, really, to your question. And even just in terms of my own viewing habits and seeing the alternative of what's on any given night in prime time. Yet I think, and maybe we need to do a better job marketing these services or making people understand sort of the one-click ease of use with our app, because, I pick it up on social media a little bit, I don't think people necessarily understand how easy it is to see all those remaining Warriors games. They may go to ESPN and see that the game is not on and then just watch something else, as opposed to realizing that I can get that product in an easy way. And I think it's, and for us, and then looking at a global audience, for example, where our games are distributed in 215 countries and territories. And you know, based on all the ratings data, we have 1 billion people watched a portion of an NBA game last season. So roughly 1 out of 7 people in the world experienced an NBA game last year. And as I travel extensively in China, Africa, India, other sort of emerging markets for the NBA, I see enormous upside there in terms of, again, people are interested in the NBA and finding ways to deliver that content directly to them.
I meant to mention earlier, by the way, the hashtag is NBA Commish for this session, and there will be Q&A a little bit later. Since you mentioned international markets, is China far and away the most important market for you right now?
It's certainly the largest from a business standpoint outside of the United States. I mean, and speaking of streaming games, for example, you know, one of the largest media companies in China, and therefore one of the largest media companies in the world, Tencent. We did a huge deal with them last season. You know, this case 5 years instead of 9 years, but where they're streaming hundreds of games a season.
And a lot
Chinese
of these are
consumers.
morning programming.
Well, exactly, and in fact, it works pretty well there, because China, which is for the most part 12 hours, you know, from the East Coast to the U.S. I mean, so we're catching people in essence during their morning commutes or when they first get to work, and Tencent said it's increasingly, you know, popular, successful programming, because again, it's largely people on, you know, buses, trains, cars, or whatever, you know, who are watching games on their phones. And in fact, ESPN just did a deal with Tencent as well to supply back, you know, called shoulder programming, sort of NBA content to Tencent sort of around our games, which I also think as more stories are told, as people go deeper into who our players are, into our teams, that'll increase the streaming usage of those games as well.
So partly what I'm hearing you say is that it's very much in the first quarter of the digital.
Very good.
I know. I could, well, because in my head
He's
I
not a
almost
sports guy.
Because in my head I almost said second inning, and I was going to be embarrassed by that. But when you talk about, you know, what we could be doing more, what you could be doing more to market League Pass or to market individual games. When you talk about the China deal, it does sound like, to your point about the supply and demand, there's a lot of potential there that has to be tapped into, and a lot of people are still getting used to watching games on their phone, or logging in and having to get all the right credentials.
No,
some people are used to it, but a lot of people aren't.
No, and look, I think it's no secret, I think, for the cable and satellite deliverables, you know, right now, that the authentication process is extraordinarily clunky. right? We go through it. I mean, I do it, with my cable subscriber, and you enter it, and then you get through it, and for whatever reason, it resets.
I have to steal my father-in-law's password in order to watch CNN on my phone, even though I work there. It's that kind of craziness. But let's talk about that authentication, and you mentioned cord cutting.
Right.
When you look at the data for cord cutting, to me it's small, but it's real. How would you describe it, and how significant is it?
I think it's exactly that. It's small, but it's real, and I think that the cable companies, the satellite companies have to respond in the marketplace.
Do you think millennials in this crowd will eventually pay for cable in some form?
You see, to me, I think it's misleading. It's like whether they pay for cable the way we know it, I think the millennials will pay for great content, and it may be at different price points. But that's why I think, when I hear the discussion in the public markets, for example, about Disney, I think the story's not really being told on the other side. Yes, number of basic subs is down. On the other hand, back to sort of even my own viewing habits, I think ESPN, the Watch ESPN app and their ability to deliver those programs directly to millennials on their phones, I think has so much potential. And and you're not limited to primetime viewing. I mean, think about, for at least, my generation growing up, everything was about prime time, and you had to be, and prime time is where the viewers were. Presumably that was because that's when people were home, and that's when they were on the couch, and that's when they were in front of their TV.
Right.
All of a sudden now, these phones now mean that the TV travels with you, right? So that notion of prime time is very different. In the same way, we can do the deal, the magnitude we did in China, because they weren't, even if when we were selling our programming in China just 5 years ago, even there, the sort of the discussions with CCTV and Shanghai Media Group were more focused, all right, well, here are the limitations because your games are in the morning, we're only going to do so many things. All of a sudden, it became a very different discussion. Well, this program is incredibly valuable because people are commuting in and watching it on these digital devices. And in a way I never would have predicted, that we're still on CCTV, the government channel there, and they still carry a large package of games. But from a marketplace standpoint, the games became much more valuable to a service like Tencent to stream it, and CNET.com, because then they're competing directly outside of prime time.
Right, right. A couple of different topics about things that will be coming up here at the conference. The first is VR. Where are you and where's the MBA on virtual reality?
For us, one of the reasons we're here at this conference, and we've been here for years, is that, we want to be on the forefront of technology. We want to try to understand it. We have a lot of games. We want to encourage those technology companies out there, frankly, whether they're our partners or not, to think MBA and to think about using our programming to experiment. So, we've done a lot with Oculus, for example. We've been experimenting with pretty much all the services in terms of what the production's going to look like. How are people willing to sit for the length of a game with a headset on?
Probably, what do you think?
Not yet. I think because even as I've experimented with it, to me at least so far, there's no way I think people are going to sit for 2.5 hours like that. I think it's, even for me, to all those technologists out there, I don't know about you, you took your glasses off, but I can't do it without my glasses in it. It's uncomfortable, and I'm sure they'll come up with a way to deal with that.
The flip side is that when I put the headset on, I don't want to take it off.
Well,
I'm so absorbed.
Interesting. I mean, I just find.
But I haven't tried a 2.5-hour basketball game in it.
But I'd say for us that, one of the things we've always said in this business long before there was virtual reality was that, at least for us, the best ticket in all of sports is that courtside seat at an NBA game, right? And so, but of course, that can't possibly scale. That Jack Nicholson seat, there he is, that's why he's there. And everybody in the world wants to be in that seat, but there's only so many per arena. But then something like virtual reality comes along, something I wouldn't have predicted, and it's completely scalable. Anyone
something I wouldn't have predicted.
Can be sitting in that seat. And not only can you be sitting in that seat, but then you can go into the locker room at halftime. You can go out of your seat, and you can have the same angle that the referee does, or you can jump, up in the air with the player, depending on how small the cameras are and everything else. So, and it's also a realization for us that in our arenas, which are 92%, to capacity, and actually attendance has been growing.
Yeah, why is that? Tell us about that.
My personal view on that is that with all this great technology out there, people still have a hunger for that communal experience. I think the same reason that people come to, a conference like this. I don't even know if it's fair to call this a conference, a happening, an event like this, and people want to be in town. Part of it's being in the sessions, part of it's being in the bars, part of it's just being around people. I think it's that arenas are a form of modern town hall. If anything, what you're seeing in cities throughout America and then also outside the United States, that communities are reinvesting in upgrading arenas, building new arenas, and of course, for very different than the stadium business, and where it's outdoors, you're weather dependent, they're much bigger, that for the well-operated arenas in most of our cities, in many cases, you're talking about those arenas being used 250, 300 dates a year. So, we have 41 home games, plus maybe some playoffs, definitely some preseason games, but then, it's concerts, obviously, it's the circus, it's ice shows, it's graduations in a lot of markets. People still want to come together for those things, but then at the same time, there are also broadcast studios for us. Because what we recognize is that for 99+% of our fans, not only are they never ever going to be in an NBA arena, most of those people will never be in an NBA city. Vast majority of them will never be in the United States. And so then back to that notion, how can we replicate that experience? And I think the part of it is the visual, can you place them courtside? But then it's audio as well. And I think there are analogies there to gamers wearing headsets, because when you come, are you checking in like when I used to be a season ticket holder in New York before I worked at the league, and I would go and tickets weren't necessarily the best, but there were a group of people who generally all came. And the only context in which I knew them was as Knick fans. There they were, and I would see them at games and knew a little bit about each other and where we worked and stuff, but not much more. But we had that communal experience of hanging out and rooting together. And I think then the question is, can you do the equivalent of checking into the game and looking to your right, looking to your left? There's those people you get to know. And then taking them to places where I couldn't even have imagined, as I said. And I mean, for example, one of the things, I recently saw that Oculus has a demonstration where it's in essence a training tape with LeBron James. And, with all the benefits of being the commissioner of the NBA in the places where I get to go, I've never, literally, been in LeBron's private gym while he's training. And he allowed, I guess, these crews to film him doing sort of what his traditional workout is. So there you are, and you're seemingly like his chest is, you're right next to him, and and those you can see the tattoos that are under his jersey, not just the ones that you can see on television. And it's quite an incredible experience where the beads of sweat and to really feel in a visceral way, what these incredible players do to prepare for these games. And then, and it's the banter as well. And for example, I know LeBron's manager, I know his agent, I know his trainer, I know a lot of the people who are in his inner circle. And they almost had to remind me when I had this headset on, it's now look to your left, look to your right. So it's not just he's there, but I'm watching and there's the Nike rep, just sort of, doing his emails on his phone in the back there. And it's all that community of people around him. And then we went from the gym, part of their tape was then he went to train in a pool and you get in the car with him. And it's funny. And so you really, it felt like you were sitting next to him. And it was funny because it was sort of a smallish car. He's in the back seat and he's kind of like this, sitting there. And he's talking and he says something about his son. Like, it's almost, you think, like, I forgot he wasn't talking to me, and then he makes a reference to his son, and then you realize there's a third row in the car, and you look back, and there his son is playing a game on a tablet behind us. And so, again, it's early days, but when I think of, in a way that's the equivalent of, for a concert, for the backstage pass, like we all grow up wishing, like, can I go back there? And I want to go where the security guy is saying I can't. And so there's enormous value in this program, but it's why we're here, because to see, what all these, incredibly brilliant entrepreneurs are doing here, and encouraging them, think NBA while you're developing these apps, think NBA when you're developing these new forms of programming and networks, because we have a lot of games and we have such interesting athletes.
I was thinking about what you said about the front row, the courtside seat. when I was most recently at MSG. It was a rare Knicks win, and I'm way up in the back. And I'm thinking, as I'm looking down at the courtside seats, what if I could put on a VR headset and watch from that perspective, even though I'm already in the arena? Because then you'd hear the crowd, you'd feel it, but you could feel like you were in the front row.
Yeah, and I guess, what they call augmented reality.
Right.
So too, no, but seriously, you're there, and I think that's an interesting application too. So rather than taking you out of the real experience, obviously, which virtual reality does, that's an interesting notion too, that you come in, it gets augmented, and it's, think about it,
Or you can be in the perspective of the player.
Yeah, I mean, and it's the perspective of the player, or you're sitting and it's, as plays are unfolding, you're getting another field of information that, Carmelo Anthony, it's that percentage of a shot. He should pass in this situation. Porzingis can do the following.
Because you talk about this at CES. Is this what you were talking about when you said that, talking about information that you all can be obtaining passively during games?
That's a good,
from the players.
It's interesting. I think when I was talking about it then, I wasn't thinking of it in terms of how you described as augmented reality. I think then I was thinking of it more as a deliverable in what now seems like a more traditional platform, sitting there, on your smartphone during a game. But as Mark Cuban often points out, there's a real conflict there because we want people to be absorbed in the real experience. I mean, for those who are NBA fans, home court really does make a difference. It makes a difference even statistically, and I think part of it is that the energy generated by the crowd. And so when you're in our arenas, unfortunately, often what you see is people are experiencing the same way they're kind of half watching television sometimes, is that because they want another field of information, they actually are looking down. And to your point, if you could come up with a way, now I don't necessarily see arena with 19,000 people wearing glasses. Maybe it's a special contact lens.
But more like Google Glass.
Yeah,
right,
no, whatever it is.
Glasses,
Yeah, maybe it's Google Glass or whatever it is. But that's the notion, because it's like one of the things now where what we have, I mean, it's in some ways primitive, but whether you're on NBA.com or on the NBA app, we have statistical fields which are designed as in essence, an old-fashioned term, but sort of as a TV companion. So that, and that notion came from when watching the media, when the media sits at our games and they have their special seats that have monitors, and so they're looking live statistical fields, the ability to watch replays or everything else while the game is going on. And I remember it sort of occurred to us, well, the media gets this special seat and this special access. We're not going to put monitors in all the fan seats, but for those people who either want to look at a device with them, or maybe even more importantly, those people at home, we should be creating those same feeds. So and that's in essence what people do. They're constantly, and I find myself doing that. If I'm watching a game, it's sort of, and we have this fantastic deal with SAP, and they create like literally an unlimited number of permutations of our data, in real time as the game is happening with this HANA program they have. And so you can go on and be making, in essence, trying to compute probability. Presumably same thing, if a coach could stop the game, what the coach would be doing. And increasingly, you see coaches do that. Clearly they're doing it. It's when you look at the assistant coaches, often it's just the analytics are only a part of it. Part of it's going to be instinct and judgment and knowing how particular players react in certain situations. But they're clearly looking at data in terms of how particular players perform in certain points of the game.
One of the questions from the crowd actually about the players is something you touched on a moment ago about LeBron, which is the players making their own content. What are those conversations like right now, given that you're heading into negotiations with the Players Association, given the rise of websites like Players Tribune? What's the dynamic at play here? Who has the power?
To me, it's not necessarily a notion of who has the power, because it's a partnership with the players, and I think clearly the league can't coexist, and we could build these spectacular arenas and these great platforms, but we can't do without the players, and the players are codependent. They, they need an infrastructure, not just to play in, but a set of rules, and rely on the thousands of people at the league office and at the teams to distribute that content. So it's symbiotic from that standpoint. But I'd say for us, and not all leagues have done it the same way, but I think we were early adopters in terms of encouraging our players. And in fact, when
You mean to tweet?
yeah,
to post on
exactly. And in
Facebook
fact,
to-
when the players, so when they come into the league as rookies, we have something called a rookie transition program. We actually set up stations in partnership with, Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, to authenticate them. And we say, because in essence, if somebody's going to be out there sort of tweeting in their name or posting pictures in their name, we might as well ensure it's them. It also gives us an opportunity to sort of set some rules of the road with them. And I think and that's worked out fairly well.
Give us an example of a rule.
I mean, a rule of the road to us, it's no different than what we explain to our players than if you were interviewing them for CNN. That at the end of the day, we are a business, and within we expect, I don't know, called a certain decorum, that a player's not going to swear, for example, that a player's not going to post something that's illicit in some ways. That and by the way, I mean, and part of it, the players understand it, that it's reputationally they don't necessarily want to put themselves in that position either. I mean, look, they make mistakes. The league office makes mistakes occasionally in terms of the things that we post, but it's actually worked out very well. And where I think it has enormous value for the league is that it makes them into the truly multi-dimensional people they are, because when they have that direct line of communication with their fans, whether it's through Players Tribune where they're writing a first-hand account, or whether it's because they're posting, it's either video or pictures of life on the bus, life on the plane, life in the locker room, or whatever else, or even their own personal interests. It's their family, it's the music they love, it's the fashion, check out these shoes I just bought, or whatever else. There's a whole large segment of our fan base out there who's like, who are these people really, and what are their interests? And I think, for us, I mean, and again, it hasn't been a difficult conversation in terms of setting those parameters, because it's essentially the same parameters as when they get interviewed by the media. I mean, maybe they push the boundaries a little bit.
But it won't undermine you in your contract negotiations that they all have their own media platforms?
I actually think it's the opposite. I think it in many ways amplifies us, it extends us. It to me, the more storytelling there is around our players, the more so-called snacking there is sort of around the edges, the more interesting this content becomes. And in fact, I mean, at least it's hard to do the perfect regression analysis as to why our ratings are up, but our ratings are up, and I think despite all of that, and I know that the so-called conventional media, I see sometimes them expressing concern. At first it was blogging, like, oh my God, like now why are you giving these people access? They haven't been here covering you day in and day out. But like, blogger, you started traditionally as a blogger. I'm not sure it even means anything anymore.
Right,
no,
it's true.
In terms of traditional media, and like, you and I were talking before, I think even for the very well-known journalists, many of whom that we both follow on Twitter, it's like I think there's a certain decorum, or there's a certain way that they produce for CNN that when they're going to tweet something, and I think even from a user standpoint, I think it's not laid out for this way, and I don't think a journalist would say this, but I think sort of tweeting in real time, I think there's a different expectation in terms of fact checking. I think when I read something, as opposed to when I then see it on air or when I see it in print. I mean, I think there's a notion, I think we all are in on it, that, all right, this is real time. We want the information in real time. This journalist isn't going to take the time necessarily to fact check that, even think about the debates.
I mean, my tweets better be right, but I do think it's incumbent on the audience of people like you who are reading to be skeptical, especially in that real-time environment.
No, precisely. Yet we desperately want that real-time information.
You were talking about Twitter. What apps do you, and by the way, let's have a line start to form for questions from the audience. We have a microphone here in the middle. What apps do you use, and what apps do you feel like you should use that you don't? Because you're on Twitter, but you're lurking. You don't have a public handle.
Okay, so I lurk a lot on Twitter, and only because I do tweet, but I tweet sort of through the NBA account. And when I think there's things that I need to deliver, I put my name Adam at the bottom of it. Of course I use the NBA app. I watch ESPN a lot. The one app that no connection whatsoever to the NBA, which I'll plug, is Evernote. I'm an extensive user of Evernote. I collect a lot of information there. I find it's very easy to use. I think the fact that the data is instantaneously transferred from platform to platform. I'm a big user of Facebook and Instagram. I find that, and there I do have accounts in my own name,
Yeah.
and I post a lot of stuff. There, it's mainly, and the reason, if you look at the content that I post, it's more that I realize I'm so fortunate to get this, in essence, back to the sort of backstage pass of being in my position. And it really came about from saying, it's just sort of, to see, Yao Ming hug Michael Jordan and Steve Ballmer as they were, waiting to go out on the floor in Shanghai before a game this October. It's just such a fascinating picture. It seems this is wasted if nobody gets to see it but the five of us back here. I think that's part there. I mean, I constantly am reading about new apps and downloading them and trying them. So I'm sort of constantly experimenting with everything out there.
So our hashtags are NBA Commish and SX Sports. Let's take a first question here.
Hi, my name's Ben Lyons. I'm actually the chief correspondent for the Players Tribune. So on behalf of Jamie and Derek, thank you for understanding what we've been doing from the start. Like you, I'm a diehard New York Knicks fan. One, will I ever see a championship? And two, how does it affect your business when the big markets like New York, the Lakers in LA, Philadelphia, struggle all at the same time, it seems?
So first, just to clarify, I'm a diehard fan of every team.
I saw you roll your eyes before when you mentioned that. So
well,
I
I grew up as a Knicks fan, but as of 1992, diehard fan of every team. But on a serious note, in terms of your question, and it's fascinating, and I get asked that all the time. People say, well, for example, obviously the Lakers are not good this year. It's no secret, and they're fascinating to watch, maybe because it's Kobe's last time on the floor, but there were no expectations this year from most people that they were going to be a playoff team. On the other hand, Knicks obviously are struggling. But for me at the league, the whole notion of big market, small market has changed, largely because of the very things we're talking about. Like, think about, just down the street, the San Antonio Spurs.
Yeah.
Yes, they are as much of a, well-run model franchise as any commissioner could hope for in any sport. 5 championships in the last 20 years. Incredibly well-run team on and off the court, wonderful players from all over the world, and a pillar of the San Antonio community. But the notion that somehow that fan base stops at the border is ridiculous in this day and age. They have a truly global following, in part because Tony Parker, is French, and Manu Ginobili is from Argentina. In part, it's, they have global players. But in addition, what social media has allowed for, that if you want to know all about Tony or Manu or Tim Duncan, you're engaged with these guys. And so, in a way, for me, I recognize as the commissioner that it's a zero-sum game. We're going to have the same number of wins and losses every season. So teams are going to always be going up or going down or whatever else. But what you want from the league office, it's not as much about, does it matter that the Lakers are good or the Knicks are good? You want 30 teams that are all competing and well managed. And I think, and each to have its own story of where they are in the life cycle, and their fans to believe that they're making the moves that are necessary, and if they make mistakes, they acknowledge them and move on from them. But another example is, think about Kevin Durant, Oklahoma City, or Russell Westbrook. These guys have as strong a global following as any players could have, and if you have any doubt, it's reflected in the marketplace by the deals they get. And by the way, the largest shoe deals in terms of revenue in the league are LeBron in Cleveland, and number 2, Kevin Durant in Oklahoma City. And talking directly, in the case both those deals happen to be with Nike, there's no suggestion from Nike that if only LeBron were still in Miami, he would have a different value, or if he'd gone to New York instead. Rather, the value comes from winning and comes from well-managed teams. So, and now, just switching slightly gears a little bit to your question, from a basketball standpoint, for us, one of the things that we negotiated for in the last round of bargaining with our players was to have more of a balanced system, where presumably that led to 30 teams all having the ability to compete. That comes, it's no secret. That's why through salary cap systems and, by having restricting what players can, what teams can do that are so-called in our tax and all that. It's I don't want to go too far afield, but it's what we're seeing is in essence an equalization of markets. Largely, I think, partly because of our collective bargaining agreement, partly because of revenue sharing among the owners, but I think just as importantly because of social media and what happens to digital media on a global basis, and that fan's ability anywhere in the world to go click and get the San Antonio Spurs, to go click, and get the New York Knicks for that matter, means that the difference in size between that New York market and Oklahoma City becomes much, much less important.
Smaller. Interesting.
Yeah, thanks for being here. It's a fascinating conversation.
Sure.
Lifelong NBA fan from Seattle, so I'm sure you anticipated something coming up here. So I'm sure you're aware of the vote that's happening on March 15th to vacate Occidental Street to get the arena shovel ready. It feels like the community in Seattle is doing everything they can to bring the NBA back. What can the NBA say about righting the wrong and bringing Seattle, a team, back?
Here's what we can say.
Something positive that I can take
well,
back to
I'd say
the basketball
the
community.
positive what you can take back, and I've said it before. I mean, first of all, obviously in my first several years at the league, we did have a team in Seattle. We had terrific teams in Seattle, great history of basketball there. I personally love the city. I've spent a lot of time there. The issue for the NBA right now is that, in part for the very reasons we talked about, that every team, in essence, can have a global following, that the need to expand the footprint by physically putting another team in a market becomes less important from a league standpoint. And therefore, the way the owners see expansion at the moment is really the equivalent of selling equity in the league. That we have 30 partners right now, 30 teams, each of those teams own 1/30 of all the global opportunities of the NBA. So then the issue becomes, if you expand, do you want to sell one of those interests off to a new group of partners? Now, one reason to do it, of course, is that if it's additive. Now, and no doubt Seattle's a great market. And I would just say that at the moment, like for me, as successful as the league is right now, that we're not yet in the position, I think, where, putting even aside profitability, where all 30 teams are must-see experiences. It's not a secret. And what's fascinating to me also, and I don't understand the answer to this, is that as I've watched the NBA over the 24 years that I've been there, the global, really, the explosion in interest in this sport, the number of kids all around the world who are playing it, you would think there would therefore be an exponential increase in great players as well. But there isn't. And I don't know why. That when you think about it, that unlike, for example, soccer, where there's, for those who follow soccer, several high-level leagues all around the world. Like there's the EPL, there's the Bundesliga, La Liga, and there's only one NBA. There's other leagues in the world, but the very best players all want to be in the NBA. Yet, we can all sit here and say that there's only so many great players in the league. And I think that's one of the issues with expansion, like even putting aside sort of the financial notion of selling equity and whether it's additive to the league as a whole to add more teams. The question becomes, is it dilutive in terms of talent? And that's something that, I'm also focused on as well. But I will say, organizations all grow over time. And on an optimistic note, I'll say that I don't think there's any doubt at some point we'll turn back to looking at whether we should grow the league. The league, of course, has grown over time. So, I just say for the moment, like my focus, I think the current NBA owners' focus is ensuring that we have a high operating, very competitive 30-team league.
Candid answer. Why, do you have any guesses on why that talent issue exists?
Well, I'm not sure. I'll say just by way of example. Take the Chinese market. A question that always frustrates me when I go to China, and we have almost 200 people there. We've been playing preseason games there for over 10 years. I'm there, 2 or 3 times a year. Is the question that media always ask me is like, when's the next Yao Ming coming? And of course, Yao Ming, 7'6", 350 pounds. Truly a freak of nature. Just incredibly skilled big man. His career was cut short because he had just some really unlucky injuries to his feet and ankles. But, and my response is, it's the wrong question because, and this is where I think a transcendent player like Steph Curry will be really helpful because, he's not small by any standards, but he's, roughly 6'4", 180 pounds or so. He's very relatable. And what I'm sort of my response back, not just to the Chinese media, but their whole system of sports development is that, they're still operating largely under a model where, and it's, and Yao Ming has written a book about it and he talks about it, that when he was a young boy, he had tall parents. You know, they measured his hands or x-rayed him or whatever else, and they said, obviously it was clear that he was going to be very tall. They pulled him out of regular school and they sent him to sports school, specifically develop him as a basketball player. Now, how are you possibly going to develop Steph Curry's if it's all based on measuring bone size, you know, when you're 9 years old? And I think so. The answer may be that we're not seeing the kind of developmental systems that we need that, for example, the United States has. And I'd also say that, and basketball's a unique sport too. And here's another example in Africa where we played our first game in the continent of Africa this past summer. It wasn't 2 teams, but it was a collection of all-stars, great NBA players. Chris Paul, who's Clippers president of our union, came, and Greg Popovich came to coach, and it was a collection of great players all came over. The first time we had done it, and it was done in conjunction with this program called Basketball Without Borders we do. We've been doing that for 15 years, and I've been in Africa 2 of the last 3 years as part of that program in the summer. And it's largely sort of the 100 best 16-year-old boys from the entire continent in Africa, in Johannesburg, and you know, roughly same number of girls, young women who roughly same age. And at least according to our scouts, you know, the talent level is very high among those young people. But what happens is the development stops because, you know, to become great, you need, and I think people, I'm sure there's analogies outside of sports, you need to be competing against the best. You know, and I think it's also, in many cases, what's the difference between great universities and mediocre universities? It's not, you could all be using the same textbooks or watching the same stream of a professor online. It's the energy, it's the peer sort of relations that come out of the classroom. It's that dynamic. And I think it's the same in basketball. And at the same time, I think even in some of these countries where it's basketball development, frankly, it's too rigid. And I think that's why when, like, how can you invent a Steph Curry? I mean, he's doing things on the court that nobody's ever done before. He's an artist. He came up, you know, he's making shots that nobody really even thought to even try to make, and especially at the rates that he's making them. And I have no doubt now, because of highlight social media, maybe there'll be a whole generation of players, of young people watching that and thinking, I'm not a big man, but I never even thought it was possible to play that way. And so I think part of it is, and something that because we as a league, we're self-interested in developing,
We're
of
only
course,
as good as your players.
great players and great players from around the world. Because, you know, it takes, if you have, like this, back to the Nick question, this rookie, Kristaps Porzingis from Latvia. I mean, one player from Latvia, not a huge country, I think 3 million people or so, but, you know, we got as many all-star votes from Latvia. I mean, it was like he turned a switch in Latvia, you know, or it becomes must-see programming. And so I think we can do more, and it may be that whether we need to build academies, you know, it's not enough just to go in for Basketball Without Borders for, you know, a week in Africa, that we really have to take more of a strong step in helping develop these players.
Interesting. 5 minutes left. Let's hear some more questions.
Cool, thanks. Just curious for the league's perspective on its growing relationship with fantasy sports, especially daily fantasy sports, and just what you envision for the future, given how daily fantasy, maybe more so than season long, has you know, is a little more ingrained with gambling.
Yeah, so you know, we jumped into the world of daily fantasy. You know, we're partners with FanDuel, and we have an equity interest in FanDuel, and roughly half our teams have partnerships with FanDuel, and roughly half our teams have partnerships with DraftKings. I mean, at the same time, obviously, we don't want to get sideways with the law. I mean, it was our interpretation of federal law going into those deals that there was a carve-out for fantasy, including daily fantasy, and daily fantasy, of course, for money. And so, ultimately, we got comfortable that it was permissible. Now, of course, as this is evolving state by state, to the extent state attorney generals or state legislatures or state courts decide that daily fantasy is impermissible in those states, obviously we will no longer, the daily fantasy companies are observing those restrictions, and we won't do business in those markets. Having said that, where I believe it's going to the question is that it is going to become a regulated industry. We just saw Virginia now was the first state where their governor, I think just last week, signed into law, you know, in essence, regulations pertaining to daily fantasy, a taxation system, a registration system. by the way, we're fully supportive of that. The more transparency, the better. There should be restrictions against employees playing, et cetera. I happen to, to me, I think where it's been interesting to watch the analysis in a lot of the states, in essence, attorney generals have come in and said, so the debate has been, is it a game of skill or is it a game of chance/gambling? Like, to me, I believe it's a game of skill, but I think it's pointless to debate it. It's daily fantasy. And I think ultimately the decision should be for those state legislatures, do you want to legalize this? My only issue, though, in some of those states I understand purely from a statutory standpoint, if you want to interpret language and say, this is not allowed, I get it. And then it's a question for the state legislature. What I don't get is where then the interpreter then goes on to moralize about the notion that this is gambling and therefore evil, when in those very same states they have casinos, racetracks, and lotteries. I mean, to me, I think gambling, regulated gambling, is part of Americana now. We have casinos in 44 states. So I from a league, at least from a personal standpoint, I don't see it as an evil. And I think now, probably most importantly, in terms of protecting the integrity of the league, my core job, I'm more concerned, now call this pure sports betting rather than daily fantasy, the fact that estimates are it's a $400 billion underground industry in the United States is the real threat to the league from our standpoint, because the extent that there is any kind of funny business going on, there's no transparency into it, as compared to think about a public stock market where the moment there's any irregular trading activity, like sort of complex algorithms flag it, tag it, and investigators step in and literally call people and say, what caused you to sell or buy that stock at this moment? And then to investigate further. So, and what I think will happen to daily fantasy, I think it's going to go through the cycle where it's going to be, in essence, outlawed or banned in states, but in the majority of states, reemerge as a regulated industry.
Let's squeeze in one more question here.
Okay. Good afternoon, Commissioner Silver. My name's Daniel Wallach. I cover sports and gambling law. Perfect segue to the next question. You wrote an op-ed 484 days ago in the New York Times calling for the legalization of sports betting under a federal framework. What has happened over the 484 days since, and what steps will the NBA take going forward? Essentially, what's the timeline for the legalization of sports betting? Will it occur within the next 5 years?
So it's so fascinating. This just goes in the category of who can predict what's going to happen next. When I wrote that piece, I had no idea that daily fantasy would become as controversial as it's now become. I mean, for example, in New York, they legally operated for 6 years. There wasn't a mention of any illegality, and then the Attorney General came out one day as his right and said, it's now my opinion that this is illegal in New York. And precisely based on the fact that he viewed it as sports betting, and sort of similar timeline played out in many other states. And so I think even the point for me of writing that op-ed was to get people talking about it. Wasn't necessarily for me or the NBA to try to lobby legislators in Washington. I mean, not something I'm comfortable doing right now, but I'm certainly comfortable giving my opinion on it. I think that the daily fantasy conversations, and now with Virginia being the first state to make clear that daily fantasy is legal and regulated in Virginia, will accelerate the conversation, because I think the gaming companies, many of whom initially I think fought daily fantasy precisely because they saw that as being a substitute for gaming, not even sports betting, but for people have so many discretionary dollars that they're going to gamble, and to the extent that here was now something legal which they could become engaged in daily fantasy. I think now as that becomes legal, I think that the gaming companies that I think understandably we're trying to protect their own businesses and keep those as casino businesses, I think are now going to see that the internet, I mean, this is a good way to end, is as disruptive in sports and in gaming as it's been in every other industry. And if you can't beat them, join them. And I think so that's what you're now going to see. And while I can't put a specific timeline on it, I think that it may happen sooner than anyone would have thought. And maybe we'll see. It depends, what party is controlling Congress and who the president is. But I think it makes perfect sense, especially when all these jurisdictions are in need of tax dollars, crumbling infrastructures, that if people don't want to, you know, raise taxes over here, if people are all going to continue to gamble on sports illegally, let's protect the integrity of the leagues, you know, let's regulate it and let's tax it.
NBA Commissioner Adam Silver, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's fun.
Awesome.
Thank you.